So, Sarah Hewitt, tell
Yes.
me the title of your book first of all.
It's Looking for the Magic, and the subtitle is Turning Grief into Hope.
And it is something you know an awful lot about. So, why have you decided to write the book?
Well, I had a difficult bereavement, and I really was in the depths of grief. And something rather magical happened to me, and I wanted to share it because I think grief, when you're in deep grief, there's one thing that's really always absent, and that's hope. Because when you've lost somebody, they're gone forever. And I've got that hope back that the person I lost has not gone forever.
Now, the person you lost is your daughter, Beth.
Yes.
And that is so difficult to try and comprehend as a parent losing a child. Tell us a bit about the background and what Beth was like. We've got a picture of Beth here,
Yes,
haven't we?
yes.
Yeah.
Beth was a joyful young woman. She was quirky, she was creative, she was energetic, and above all, she was kind. You know, she was kind to everyone. She didn't, you know, when people say they didn't have a bad bone in their body, you know, just sometimes she could get cross like all of us, but she was just wonderful. And she had that energy. She'd come into a room and she'd dance. If she was happy, she'd dance, she'd sing out loud. You know, we might be walking through town and she'd just burst into song, you know, and everyone loved her. You know, she was just a wonderful young woman.
But she did have challenges, didn't she?
She did have challenges. I mean, she was diagnosed with autism when she was 16, but actually it was never a problem until it was a problem. And I think when she was that age, I think young people, they do have challenges, don't they, when they become, you know, young adults. And that led to eating disorder and mental illness, which was so difficult for her and of course also for everyone who loved her.
How did you manage that? Because you will have noticed the change, won't you?
Yes. I tried to just carry on as if nothing had happened. I tried to keep everything very normal. And what I always tried to do when she was suffering was not show any shock, you know, and just sort of say, well, to keep those lines open so that we could chat. Yeah, and so we did. You know, I think when anyone has a mental illness, relationships are strained. But we had a good relationship most of the time, I would say.
Did the eating disorder, did that lead to problems at school and those sorts of things, or not particularly?
Yes, I think it got in the way of her, you know, I mean, she was very clever, she was very creative, she did well in her, she got excellent GCSEs in spite of her illness. But I think it was relationships, you know, I think at the root of it, it was seeing other girls behaving in a certain way and her not quite getting it because of the autism. And not having, I think the key to it was not being able to just be herself. There's a lot of pressure on young people, girls and boys, to behave in a certain way. If you're a bit different, if you're a bit quirky, which is actually wonderful, because how awful would it be if we were all the same? But if you're a bit quirky, sometimes in your teens, you know, it's people could be bullying you or taking the mickey out of you. And if you're a sensitive soul, as Beth was, sort of think, you know, oh, actually, maybe I need to modify how I'm behaving. And yeah, that was difficult for her, I think.
She did have a relationship, and actually
Yes.
she had a son, didn't she?
Yes, she did. Yes.
How old was she at the time?
She was 19. Yes, and so she left home. She didn't go on to finish her education, but at the time of her death, she was in a good place, actually, which was why it was such a shock to us. And she had said that maybe she was even going to finish her education. She was writing poetry, she was writing a book, she was painting, and so she had a lot to look forward to.
But she took her own life, didn't she?
Yes, she did. Yes. Yes.
Tell us about that time, because that must be still quite raw.
Sometimes I think, gosh, why didn't I see it coming? And I think this is something, I've spoken to lots of parents who've lost children in this way, and the common denominator is blaming yourself, feeling guilty. Why didn't I see it happening? Why didn't they talk to me? Why didn't she phone me that day when she was having such an awful day and say, Mum, this has happened. Can you come and see me? Can you come and talk to me? But I think when people are in that extreme trauma, a traumatic situation, or they get to the end of their tether, they lose sight of the fact that everyone loves them. And they actually believe they're on their own. And this, a lot of parents say to me, you know, why couldn't I have done something? But, you know, when young people leave home, you know, you're sending them out into the wide world, and you can't watch them all the time, can you?
You can't. How did you hear about Beth's death? How did you hear?
Well, I had a phone call, and it was first of all, I had a text, and then my son phoned and said, Beth's in hospital, and it doesn't look good. And I knew then. And Richard said, that's my husband. He said, shall I drive? And I said, no, I'll drive. And I drove slowly to the hospital because I just knew.
Yeah.
And when we got there, they were trying to bring her back to life. And they did a number of times, but ultimately they couldn't save her.
Obviously, a dark time then for you and for Richard and her brother as well, you know, the difficult situation. What got you through that difficult time?
Do you know, I think my grandson, because no matter how big my grief was, it was totally eclipsed by his loss. You know, he was 5, he'd lost his mother, and, you know, watching him, and he would come to stay, and he would be talking out loud to her. You know,
talking to Mum?
Yeah, why did you have to kill yourself? Being really angry. And we'd walk round the churchyard, and he would ask me, how old was that person when they died? How old was that person when they died? And it made him, we all lost our innocence that day because the worst had happened. You know, you always look at other people and think, that could never happen to me. So it happened to all of us. But to him, at 5 years old, to have that happen to him, you know, was just incomprehensible. And I think it stopped me even thinking about my own grief to start with, because I just had to be strong for him. And my son, you know, my son was wonderful when we lost Beth. We had a wonderful evening. We went away, actually. We camped so that we could see my grandson the next day. And we camped under the stars, and we sat outside and we looked at the stars, and we both wondered if one of those was Beth. And, you know, he was just brilliant. Yeah.
After a while, something happened that changed you completely, really, and your outlook, and you're looking back at Beth's life as well.
Yes.
Tell me about what you read, what you discovered.
So to put it in context, we're talking about 3 years later. So grief has its own path, and you can push it away. I pushed it away and I pushed it away, but eventually it'll get you. And Richard always says to me, you know, you can't go round it, you have to go through it. And I started to go through it, and it got worse and worse and worse. And I felt absolutely wretched and hopeless, to the point where, I mean, I didn't say anything to Richard at the time, but I used to spend a lot of my own time looking for ways to end my own life.
So you were in a very dark place.
I was in a very dark place. I thought, well, what's the good of me, now my child is gone. I just wanted to be with her, whether that was to end the pain. And I don't think I believed at that point that I would see her again, but just that I could get some peace, because I just couldn't get away from it. It was just awful. And I'd also lost contact with my grandson because of various situations within her ex-partner's family.
So 2 losses, really.
I do say to Richard actually now that I feel the loss of my grandson is, to me, as bad as the loss of my daughter, because I loved him to bits. Well, I love him to bits. Yeah.
But what changed? What happened?
So one night, Richard said to me, "It'll do you good." We'd moved into a little group of barn conversions, and one of the ladies next door was having a get together, and he said, "Why don't you come? It might do you good." And I said, I can't even contemplate it. I can't even contemplate making new friends, or I've just had no energy for it. I said, "You go, it'll do good." And he said, "Well, you sure you're all right?" And I said, "I'm all right, I'm going to have an early night." And what I used to do was have an early night, take my laptop to bed and watch videos of people talking about traumas they'd had that were worse than my own. And I know that sounds a bit strange, but I used to think, that'll take my mind off it, because actually what's happened to me is not that bad. And it also almost
So your trauma wasn't as bad as the ones you were watching?
Yeah. So, when you go onto something like YouTube and you get suggestions of what you might want to watch. So it was always, mass murder or things like this. I don't know why, And this particular night, I opened my laptop, and these algorithms hadn't suggested these awful films. They suggested things like near-death experiences, the investigation of life after death. And I thought, okay. Started watching them. And one video that really drew me in was a video, because I'm quite sort of evidence-based. I want to, I'll believe if somebody can prove that to me. And it was a scientist, and he's called Oliver Lazar. And he's been very kind to me since. Actually, I'm in touch with him. And he had a profound spiritual experience, which you can watch the video and read about. He's written a book. And it led him to set up a study of people who've lost loved ones and who've visited mediums, spiritual mediums, and then been able to speak to their loved ones, and how it's changed their lives, and how it's not taken their grief away, because that can never go, but given them hope that it's not the end, that they will see their loved ones. And I was thinking, he's a scientist. And it's been a struggle for him, because in a materialistic, scientific world, for him to sort of put his head upon the parapet and say, "This is what's happened to me," that was very brave.
Because people want proof, don't they?
People have to have proof. And his study actually showed that people that had gone to see a medium, even if they were very, very sceptical, about 80% came out and said, "Gosh, there's something there. I've actually spoken to a person that I've lost." So I was thinking, okay. And I just had this overwhelming sense of peace, something that I hadn't felt since Beth died, something that just came over me. And I just felt I settled down to sleep. I closed my laptop, and as I closed my laptop, the window was slightly open, and it was summer. And this breeze came through, and these three shadows, these three shadows came across through the window, down, and then went out the doorway, as if leaving me to this peaceful transition. And I had the best night's sleep I'd had since Beth had died. And at the same time, Richard was talking to our new neighbour. And our new neighbour was a spiritual medium. Now, I'd never heard of this before. I didn't know anything about it. And unbeknownst to me, Richard had believed all his life, and we'd never really spoken about it. He was religious, he was a Christian, but he also felt his parents with him. He didn't question it. He knew he was going to see them again. But for some reason, this had never come up. We'd never talked about it. And he spoke to Sam and said, I don't know what to do about Sarah. I'm desperately worried about her. I feel that something awful is going to happen. And she said, well, do you want me to talk to her? So the next morning, he said, oh, I've met this lady. And she came round and we had a coffee. And in the meantime, I'd looked up spiritual mediums in the area and been drawn to a lady called Nicola. And she said, yeah, I know Nicola. She said, I'm getting, yeah, she's the right one to go and see. So I left it a while and I booked an appointment, and I drove to this lady's house, and it was a very modern, normal looking house. And as I drove, I had this same feeling of overwhelming peace and love. And I knew that I was going to talk to somebody. I didn't know who it was going to be. I hoped it would be Beth, but I knew I was going to get a message. And she opened the door and she said, there's lots of people here to talk to you. And as we walked in, she sort of touched me on the arm and she said, I feel there's been a suicide. And I said, yes, there has. And I sat down, and that day I saw all the people that I've lost in my life came that day. It was absolutely life-changing and incredible.
So how long were you there for?
About 2 hours. It felt like time had just become irrelevant. It felt like it could have been 6 hours, it could have been 10 minutes, I don't know. I lost all concept of time. But it was a magical experience because I've since learned that I have these abilities myself, and in my mind's eye I could see the people that I've lost coming into the room, and then I could feel them with me. And the feeling that I got was a massive tingling, and I just knew they were there.
Does it still happen now? Do you go and see a medium now, or what happens?
Yeah, so on that day, my dad came, and I love my dad to bits, I miss him, and he'd organised all these people to come, and Beth was the last one to come in. And I just tell you this little short story because this was my evidence, if I needed evidence. I've been saying to Richard, because where she's buried is a long way away, and because it was very neglected and nobody from like her ex-partner or anybody ever went to visit, it was always really overgrown when I went, and I used to get I think this was what at that particular time was making me feel really rubbish. And I said, I think we ought to consider trying to get her moved to where she was happiest and where we can all visit her. I might try and get the ashes moved. And the last thing that the medium told me that Beth said to her was, Mum, the ashes, don't worry, leave them where they are.
Amazing, amazing. What did Richard say when you went home after that first meeting with a medium?
he just sat there and listened and took it all in. And funny enough, his mum had come. She was the second person to come. I'd never met his mum. And I described how Nicola had described her. And he said, Mum would not have wanted to miss out. She loved to be in on everything. And she told me that she loved me and that she was pleased that me and Richard had found each other, you know.
And up until this point, you weren't spiritual at all, were you?
I don't think... Now, this is where writing my book was very useful, because I've gone back into my childhood and when I'd lost people and things had happened, which I now remember, that you push to one side when you grow up. You push these things to one side because you look for a logic and you think, oh, that must have been this or that. So when my grandfather died, I mean, I was very close to my grandfather, and he died and I missed him so much. And there was one night where I was walking home with a boyfriend, and there was this flickering lightning. Didn't make a noise, but it flickered. And I just knew it was him. And I said to my boyfriend, that's Grandad. And he was really spooked. And every time we asked a question, I got this flash of light, you see. And my boyfriend he got me home and he ran off. He was so spooked. And I went home and I got into bed and I said to Grandad, if you're there, flash the light. And the light flashed. And I asked him questions. And then, because I was on my own, I started to get a bit spooked and it stopped. So all these things that happened reminded me, and yeah.
And the other connection, just coming back to Beth again here, is that she wrote like spiritual type poetry.
Yes, she did. And when my dad died, she said to me, because I was looking at her and thinking, she doesn't seem to be very upset, and actually quite hurt me, you know. And she said, but Mum, you'll see him again. He's with you right now. You know, and she totally believed it. And I think that's when she left us, she believed she was going to the spirit world, and that was not the end. And she actually said to her son, you know, I'll be with you, you know.
Has the book helped you through a difficult time as well? How do you feel now you've written the book?
I feel it was very cathartic. I feel like this is what I was put on this earth to do. It's sort of like bridging a gap. So you've got books about spirituality for people who are already in that space, who are spiritual already. But you haven't got books where normal people, like just ordinary people like me, I say normal, maybe I'm not normal, but ordinary people like me have an experience which just completely changes their life. And I think for me, helping other people, so I have already helped people by talking to them about my experience, and it leads them to look for their own evidence. I'm not saying people will believe what I've written and it will change their life, because it won't. And grief is something you have to go through. But if you have some hope, then maybe it's not so bad.
You can understand, though, why some people will be sceptical.
Absolutely.
Because you were looking for proof. How do you then prove what you've seen to other people? That's very difficult.
Exactly. And there might be things where people will think, and people do say to me, well, actually, you know, I always think of my dad when I see a robin, for example, and I'll say, well, yeah, that's your dad talking to you. But if people are curious and they are led to a spiritual medium themselves, they will receive their own evidence. You know, a medium's job is to act as a medium between the spirit world and ourselves. But they are also tasked with giving you evidence, because without that evidence, you've only got their word that that person, you know, is who they say it is. Oh, this is your dad. I have your dad with me. Yeah, but nobody knew that his hobby was this or that. Nobody knew that we had this lovely little phrase between us that he used to always say, or, you know, nobody knew that, you know, we would go to a certain place together and that was our special place, you know, and this is the evidence they will bring to you.
Just remind us of the title of the book again.
It's called Looking for the Magic, and Beth told me in a spiritual reading to look for the magic, and that's what I'm doing.